The thing that Postumus does that's different is he doesn't want to build a new Rome. He wants to take Gaul, that is actually doing quite well in this point, and not have its wealth siphoned off into a Rome that can no longer pay for it. So he creates kind of an empire that's a breakaway from Rome. In our conversation on the Freedom Pact, we barely scratched the surface of Rome's true end. We tend to frame it as a collapse, a dramatic, sudden failure, but that's a misnomer. Rome didn't just vanish, it decentralized. When the central authority ceased delivering value, the periphery rationally pivoted to build its own structures. This process, which began in 260 AD with Postumus's Breakaway Empire in Gaul, offers the most critical lesson for our time. Today, I want to break down why this wasn't a failure, but a functional transition, and why the same forces are accelerating in our world right now. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. This is the Roman Pattern. I'm the CEO of Command Your Brand, and you can find us at commandyourbrand.com. If you came here from the Freedom Pact, welcome. We covered a lot in an hour: the Roman Pattern thesis, the crisis of the 3rd century, Postumus and the Gallic Empire, Zenobia and the Palmyrene Empire, national divorce as a modern parallel, the 5 good emperors, Hadrian's frontier work, currency debasement, 1913 as the American pivot year, Constantine's gradual gold standard reform, and the whole local versus national question, where you should actually focus your attention. Needless to say, those were a lot of things. This video pulls on one specific thread underneath all of it: the breakaway empire pattern, because that's the part of Roman history that doesn't get told, and it's the part with the most direct application to what's happening right now. Before I get into the framework, there are a few corrections I owe you on the record. First, at one point I said the Eastern Roman Empire fell in 476, and that's exactly backwards. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we usually call the Byzantine Empire, lasted all the way till 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. That's almost 1,000 years difference, so I did misspeak. The point I was making was that the fall was political and administrative rather than civilizational, and that still stands. But the dates matter, and I want to get them right. Second, when I described how Postumus came to power, I compressed the mechanism. The actual trigger was a dispute over a war booty taken from the Frankish raiders. Postumus troops on the Rhine wanted the booty distributed to them. Saturninus, the teenage son of Emperor Gallienus, and his guardian Silvanus, demanded it be sent to the imperial treasury instead. And the troops responded by declaring Postumus emperor, marching on Cologne, and killing Silvanus and Saturninus. So the immediate cause was money. The structural cause was Rome's center had stopped delivering protection in exchange for the wealth it was extracting. Those are two different things, and the distinction is going to matter. Third, on Constantine's monetary reform. In the conversation, I described it as a model for how you fix currency gradually, and it's worth being more precise than I was. Constantine introduced the gold solidus around 312 AD, and he required taxes to be paid in gold, which kept the gold circulating instead of being hoarded. The reform worked. But it worked specifically because Constantine had the military and political authority to impose that requirement, and because the late empire had accumulated enough gold reserves to actually back the new coin. A modern version would need the same combination: sustained political will across decades, plus enough asset backing to reform the credible. It's not impossible, it's hard. Okay, with those corrected, here's the framework. The word collapse does a lot of heavy lifting in the discourse around Rome. It conjures fire in the streets, barbarians at the gates, civilization ending in one dramatic moment, and the conventional story gives you a clean end date, 476 AD, the year the Western Roman Empire formally stopped existing. But the story is largely fiction, or more accurately, it's a narrative applied after the fact to a process that the people living through would have never recognized as collapse. Here's what actually happened. Starting in the 3rd century AD, the Roman center began losing its ability to deliver value for the taxes it extracted. The currency was being debased, the frontiers were under pressure, and the political class was consumed by civil wars over who got to be emperor next. Every year of the crisis made the calculation worse for the provinces paying into the system. By 260 AD, the calculation broke. A Roman general named Postumus decided that paying taxes to a center that could not protect Gaul was no longer worth doing, so he stopped. And the Roman Empire fractured into three pieces almost overnight. That's the breakaway pattern. It's not separatism in the modern political sense. It's the rational response of a periphery to a center that has stopped functioning. Rome demonstrated it at scale in the 3rd century, and the pattern kept going, in different forms across the next 250 years, until what we call the fall of Rome had completed itself. So let me walk you through how it actually played out. The 3rd century crisis is the term historians use for roughly 235 to 284 AD, a 49-year window during which Rome had at least 26 emperors, and almost all of them were killed by their own troops or by the next claimant. The political administration of the empire was in a continuous chaos. But the breakaway pattern didn't actually trigger until 260. It's the year the Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur I at the Battle of Edessa. Valerian was the first Roman emperor in history to be taken alive by a foreign enemy. He spent the rest of his life as Shapur's prisoner, used as a human footstool according to some sources, whenever Shapur mounted his horse. He died in captivity. And you have to understand what that capture did. This was a civilizational shock unlike anything Rome had experienced. The emperor, the visible symbol of Roman power, of Roman protection, was a prisoner of a foreign king. He couldn't be ransomed. He couldn't be rescued. His son Gallienus was left ruling alone in Rome, having to pretend publicly that the situation was manageable. It wasn't manageable. The provinces were watching. The military commanders on the frontiers were watching as well. And the question they were all asking was the same question every periphery asks when the center fails. What exactly are we paying for? Within months, the empire fractured. Postumus was a Roman general commanding troops on the Rhine frontier. He was experienced, competent, and his soldiers trusted him. He had spent years defending Gaul, Britain, and Hispania against the Frankish and Alemannic raids that the central administration had largely failed to support. In 260, the same year Valerian was captured, his troops took war booty from a successful campaign against Frankish raiders. Saturninus, the emperor's teenage son, and his guardian Salvanus demanded the booty be sent to the imperial treasury. The troops refused. They declared Postumus emperor and marched on Cologne, where Saturninus and Salvanus were stationed, and they killed them both. Now, what Postumus did next is the part that actually matters. He didn't march on Rome. He didn't claim to be the legitimate emperor of the whole empire. He stayed in Gaul. He minted his own coins, established his own administration, had his own senate, his own consuls, his own legal apparatus. He called his new state the Imperium Gallarium, the Empire of the Gauls. It included Gaul, Britain, and most of Hispania, about a quarter of the territorial Roman Empire. And here's the thing. The Gallic Empire was not a separatist insurgency. It was a functioning Roman successor state, run by a Roman general, staffed by Roman administrators, and operating under Roman law, defended by Roman legions, and using Latin. It worshipped Roman gods. It was Roman in every meaningful sense, except that it no longer sent revenue to Rome, and no longer recognized the emperor in Rome as its legitimate sovereign. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The Gallic Empire's currency was more stable than Rome's during this period. Postumus maintained higher silver content in his coinage than Gallienus did in his. The Gallic Empire's frontier defense was more effective than Rome's. Its administration was more responsive. Under any honest comparison, the breakaway state was performing better than the legitimate one. And that's the brutal logic of the breakaway pattern. The periphery doesn't break away because it's worse off. It breaks away because the center has become the net cost rather than the net benefit. And once the periphery can produce comparable governance on its own, the relationship becomes economically irrational. to maintain. The Gallic Empire lasted 14 years under 5 successive emperors, Postumus, Marius, Victorinus, and Tetricus, until it was reunified with Rome in 274 AD. Now, the first clip.
We may be mislabeling what is really maybe a process of adaptation and reorganization.
I actually would agree with you on that. I think it really is a process of adaptation and reorganization. And I think the thing you have to look at, going back to the crisis of the 3rd century, after Valerian falls in 260, the empire actually breaks into 3 pieces. The host of the Freedom Pact actually landed the right framing in our conversation. Collapse is the wrong word. The word is decentralization, and the Roman case demonstrates this pattern in concentrated form in the 3rd century, before it played out across the rest of the empire over the next 200 years. Because while Postumus was building the Gallic Empire in the west, something parallel was happening in the east. Palmyra is a wealthy Syrian trading city, a desert oasis that controlled the caravan routes between Rome and the Persian Gulf. By the mid-3rd century, it had become one of the richest cities in the Eastern Empire, and partly that was because Rome's collapse made Palmyra the de facto guarantor of trade security in the region. Odenathus of Palmyra was a local Arab nobleman who functioned in practice as Rome's military proxy in the east. After Valerian's capture, he defeated the Persians, recovered Roman territory, and restored order across Syria and Mesopotamia. Gallienus gave him titles for it: Dux Romanorum, Corrector Totus Orentis, the leader of the Romans, corrector of the East. Functionally, Odenathus was running the Eastern Empire while pretending to be Rome's loyal subordinate. He was assassinated in 267. The circumstances are unclear. Maybe a family dispute, maybe a Roman conspiracy, maybe internal Palmyrene politics. What's clear is what happened next. His widow Zenobia took control of Palmyra and his de facto Eastern command. Her formal claim was that she was acting as a regent for her young son, Valbanathus, but the substantive decisions were hers, and the decisions she made were extraordinary. By 270, Zenobia had conquered Egypt, which meant control of roughly a quarter of the Roman grain supply. By 271, she had taken most of Asia Minor. By 272, she had her son officially declared Augustus, emperor, and was minting coins with both their portraits, no longer acknowledging Rome's authority in any form. At its peak, the Palmyrene Empire controlled Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Arabia, and most of modern Turkey. It's the same pattern as the Gallic Empire. The periphery declared independence because the center had stopped. The periphery used existing Roman infrastructure, Roman roads, administrative law, military structures, to govern itself. And the successor state was, in most observable ways, more functional than the legitimate empire it had broken away from. So for roughly 3 years, the Roman Empire existed in 3 pieces. There was a central Roman Empire under Gallienus and his successors controlling Italy and the central Mediterranean, a Gallic Empire in the west under Postumus dynasty, and a Palmyrene Empire in the east under Zenobia. None of them recognized the others. All of them claimed to be Roman. This is what decentralization looks like in practice. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require a separatist ideology. It doesn't even require the breakaway leaders to want to break away. It just requires a center that has stopped delivering value for what it extracts, and a periphery with the administrative and military capacity to govern itself. The empire was reunified by a single emperor, Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 AD. He defeated Zenobia at Emesa in 273 and brought her to Rome in golden chains as part of his triumph. He defeated Tetricus and the Gallic Empire in 274, though Tetricus surrendered relatively easily and was actually given a Roman governorship as a reward. Aurelian was an extraordinary emperor, possibly the most competent military commander Rome produced in the entire 3rd century. He earned the title Restutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, and after 5 years he held the empire together by sheer force of personality and military capacity. Then he was assassinated by his own staff in 275, allegedly because his secretary, afraid of being punished for a minor offense, forged execution orders against several senior officers, who then preemptively murdered Aurelian to save themselves. The political class killed the man who had restored the political class. We covered this in the 3 patterns that killed Rome episode. This pattern repeats across the late Roman history because the institutional incentive structure produces it. Reformers who threaten the system get eliminated by the system they're trying to reform. But the deeper point is this. Aurelian's reunification was temporary because the underlying decentralization pressure was structural. The center had not solved the problems that produced the breakaway empires in the first place. The currency was still debased, the frontier was still under pressure, and the provinces still received less protection than they paid for. Aurelian had reunified the empire administratively, while leaving the underlying decentralization logic completely in place. So the pattern reasserted itself in slower forms over the next 2 centuries. Diocletian came to power in 284 AD, and he basically admitted the structural reality. The empire was too large for one emperor to govern, so he split it into 4, the Tetrarchy. 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, 2 junior emperors, the Caesars, each with their own administrative region. Now, that wasn't decentralization in the dramatic Postumus and Zenobia sense, but it was decentralization in substance. The empire was being formally subdivided because the unified version had become unmanageable. Constantine moved the imperial capital east to Constantinople in 330 AD, and that's another form of decentralization, capital migration. The center of gravity of the empire shifted away from Rome itself. The old capital became increasingly a ceremonial city rather than an administrative one, while the administrative weight moved east, where the wealth and population were concentrated. Then Theodosius split the empire formally in 395, east and west, separate emperors for each, never to be reunified. We covered the consequences of that in the Theodosius episode. The split was the formal acknowledgement of what had been substantially true for over a century. The empire was too large to govern as a unit, and decentralization in the form of permanent administrative division was now the operating model. So when the Western political administration formally ended in 476, it wasn't a collapse. It was the final transfer of authority from a distant imperial center to a local successor kingdom: Visigothic, Ostrogothic, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, Vandal. Kingdoms that preserved most of what mattered about Roman civilization. Roman law survived. The Latin language survived. Roman administrative structure survived. The Catholic Church inherited Rome's administrative architecture and carried it across the medieval period. The successor kingdoms preserved Roman engineering, agriculture, forms of governance. What ended in 476 was the transfer of revenue to a distant capital that had stopped delivering value. The civilization didn't end. It decentralized into successor components. So this is the pattern. Civilizations don't usually collapse, they decentralize. When the center delivers value for the taxes it extracts, the periphery pays willingly, and the unified structure persists. When the center stops delivering value, through monetary debasement, administrative failure, military weakness, and political dysfunction, the periphery's calculation changes. The relationship becomes economically irrational to maintain, and the periphery starts producing alternative structures. And those alternative structures don't have to be separatist in intent. The Gallic Empire didn't want to destroy Rome. Postumus never marched on the capital itself. The Palmyrene Empire didn't want to conquer Italy. Zenobia operated for years as Rome's de facto eastern proxy, believing for formalizing her independence. These weren't insurgencies. They were local responses to central failure. Now, the center can temporarily reunify through exceptional leadership. Aurelian proved that. But the reunification doesn't last unless the structural conditions that produced the decentralization actually get addressed. Aurelian's didn't last because he didn't fix the currency, the frontier, the political incentive structure. The pressure reinserted itself within a generation. The fall of any civilization is really the cumulative completion of the decentralization process. Rome's took 250 years, from Postumus in 260 to the formal end of the Western administration in 476. The medieval European map of kingdoms that emerged was the final form of Rome's decentralization. Successor states that preserve Roman substance while operating without Roman political unity. And this frame matters because it changes what civilizational collapse actually means. The substance of a civilization, the language, law, religion, the administrative practices, the engineering knowledge, well, all of that can survive even when the political unity fractures. The transfer of authority from a distant capital to a local successor isn't the end of civilization. It's a transformation of how authority is distributed within it. When central authority weakens, decentralization happens whether anyone is planning it or would prefer that it not happen. The question isn't whether it happens. The question is what form it takes. And we're watching the pattern play out in real time across the Western political systems. The European Union has been decentralizing through Brexit, through Polish and Hungarian regional assertion, through the Italian and French sovereignist movements. The United Kingdom is decentralizing internally. Scottish independence pressure, the Welsh language revival, Northern Irish realignment. The United States is decentralizing through state-level divergence. California, Texas, and Florida now operate under such different legal, regulatory, and cultural regimes that they function increasingly as distinct civic territories that happen to share a federal structure. We're also watching newer decentralization forms emerge, forms that wouldn't have been possible in Rome's era. Charter cities and special economic zones, like Prospera in Honduras and the SES experiments across Africa and Asia. Network states and digital nations, Balaji Sivrasan's framework for political entities that begin online and acquire territorial substance. Cryptocurrency and decentralized finance, monetary decentralization running parallel to the political climb. And Singapore, Dubai, and Hong Kong functioning as city-state alternatives to the nation-state model. None of these are catastrophic ends. They're decentralization forms. Some will produce better governance than the centralized alternatives they're replacing, and some will produce worse. Remember, the Gallic Empire produced better currency and better frontier defense than Rome did during the same period. The Palmyrene Empire produced more effective trade security than Rome did. Decentralization doesn't automatically mean degradation. It just means a different distribution of authority. So the question for any individual living through a decentralization phase isn't whether to support or oppose the process. The process is structural, and it will continue regardless of anyone's preference. The question is which successor entities are likely to preserve the substance of the civilizational life worth preserving, and how to position yourself relative to that distribution. Now, the second clip.
There's been a debate in the US over the past few years of something called national divorce. And it's the idea of, maybe certain states or territories would pull away because central government isn't, as keen as supporting them in a lot of ways. Now, if you even look at how the U.S. Civil War went, Lincoln didn't allow that to happen. That's a lot of why he took the actions he took. So I don't think it's necessarily something that would function in the same way as it did in Rome. But the fact that there's those sentiments out there tells you that there's a lot of things wrong at the center that kind of at the peripheries, they're looking at, is the center really doing those things for us anymore? We're still paying taxes, we're still supporting a military, but what's it doing for us?
This is what civilizational collapse usually is. Not collapse, decentralization. 250-year process minimum, during which a previously united political structure transfers authority from a weakening center to strengthening peripheries. Peripheries that produce comparable or superior governance using inherited civilizational substance. Rome demonstrated this in concentrated form in the 3rd century with the Gallic and Palmyrene empires, and then it demonstrated it in slower forms across the next 2 centuries. Diocletian's tetrarchy, Constantine's eastern capital, Theodosius's permanent split, and the medieval successor kingdoms that emerged after 476. The fall of Rome was the completion of a process, not the trigger of one. The question for our own moment isn't whether decentralization is coming. It's already running across every major Western political system. The question is what form it takes, and whether the substance of civilization makes it into the successor entities. Same playbook, different century. Same result. The civilization survives the political structure. It just doesn't survive in the form anyone was expecting. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. This has been the Roman Pattern. I'll see you Monday.